Hello. Uh, Welcome to our next class. This week we will be looking at the philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche, and a part of the class where we're going to look at something called ethical egoism. And, most of the time when we think about ethics and being ethical, we think about this with regard to how our actions affect other people. And obviously, as current events have shown, these things are very much close to people's minds and hearts right now. Well, Nietzsche is going to approach this in a much, much different fashion. And I do want to kind of give you a word of advice when you're reading any of these philosophers. Unfortunately, we're only spending a very short amount of time on any of these individuals, and there is a lot more that's going on with their thought than we can actually cover. This course is called Introduction to Philosophy. So, all we're really doing is getting a very, very sort of brief sort of overview of these men's thought, right? And so we just have to keep in mind that there's probably more here that you could look at with any of these philosophers and probably get a better sense of where they're coming from. It might not change ultimately your opinion on the validity of their ideas, but you would probably have a better sense of maybe where they're going. Friedrich Nietzsche is one of those philosophers that is very easily misunderstood by a whole range of people. Nietzsche is a philosopher. If you haven't ever heard this phrase, the phrase that God is dead, Nietzsche coined this phrase. And so usually I would have students who might necessarily be religious, and they kind of like Nietzsche because Nietzsche is, we'll just go ahead and say, an atheist. And so that's kind of their guy. And then there would be religious students who would obviously may have a little bit of reticence reading Nietzsche. But as we will see, Nietzsche is sort of an equal opportunity offender. Uh, Even though Nietzsche is not a believer in God, he does not necessarily mean or see in that something that is, on the face of it, a situation that might be easy to face. And we will kind of look at this. Um, so we're going to go ahead, and you have three readings this week that you were to look at. And uh, obviously, normally I would do each of these over a week period. So we would take about 3 weeks to cover Nietzsche, and we're basically doing it in 1 week. So I'm going to try to condense it down and try to keep our lecture between an hour, maybe hour and 15 minutes at max. And I'm just going to try to go through and give you an idea of where Nietzsche is coming from. And then if you have any questions, as always, you are more than welcome to reach out to me so you can kind of figure out where I'm coming from, where Nietzsche is coming from. You can ask these questions. So the first reading we're going to take a look at is Morality as Anti-Nature, and that is on page 25. If I can even kind of turn my own page here. So if you look at the title ought to tell you sort of where Nietzsche is going to be going with regard to this reading. So Nietzsche is basically claiming in this particular reading that morality is not natural. There's nothing natural to being moral as we understand it. Okay, and so I'm going to start reading on page 25, section 1. I'm going to read that first kind of paragraph, and then we will kind of stop in places for you to understand what he's talking about. So he says, all morality or all passions have a time when they are nothing but fatal, when they drag their victim down with the heaviness of their stupidity. When he says passions here, another thing to think about is desire. So we have desires. We have these sort of drives for things that we want. And so all passions have a time when they're nothing but fatal, when they drag their victim down with the heaviness of their stupidity. And later, at a much later time, when they marry the spirit, they spiritualize themselves. Okay, so here, if you look at your little footnote on page 25, it's footnote 32 at the very bottom. It gives you, he just talked about spiritualizing a passion. Now, when we hear spirit, we tend to think of it maybe in a religious context, that man has a spirit, and then once he's dead, that spirit will go on to the afterlife and be judged, or in other religious traditions in Hinduism or something, the Atman is then released from the body and returns to Brahman or the One. Well, Nietzsche is not thinking of spirit in this sort of sense, okay? He is speaking of spirit, as it says on this footnote, that to spiritualize something is to integrate it into a higher, more refined level of human consciousness, okay? So what is he saying here? He's kind of saying, look, when there's a time of life when you have these desires and passions, and basically he's kind of talking about young people. You have drives and desires for things, and these things can kind of get us into trouble. We can all maybe remember a time in our life when we were younger where maybe a passion for having fun or for just sort of doing things our way kind of got us in a little bit of trouble, okay? Well, Nietzsche here is saying that is true. People's passions and following their passions can sometimes give you trouble. But then what happens is you get older, that energy that those passions kind of create within us, sometimes as we get older, we're able to discipline those and focus them in a more mature direction, okay? And so that's what he's saying here. So he said, so I'll continue. He goes, it used to be said on that account of the stupidity in passion, one made war against passion itself. One conspired to destroy it. All the old moral monsters are of one mind. The passions must be killed. The best known formula for this is in the New Testament, in that Sermon on the Mount, in which, by the way, things are not contemplated from a height at all. For instance, there is, oh, I'm sorry, I lost my place. For instance, there is said with reference to sexuality, if your eye offends you, pluck it out. Fortunately, no Christian acts according to this prescription today. And why does he say that? Because there would probably be a lot of eyeless Christians running around. To destroy the passions and desires merely in order to protect oneself against their stupidity and the disagreeable consequences of their stupidity seems to us to be today an acute form of stupidity. We no longer admire dentists who pull out teeth so they won't hurt anymore. So really what he has said in this paragraph is that, look, human beings have passions, and sometimes in the pursuit of those passions, we do foolish or foolhardy things. And we have to suffer the consequences of that. Well, Nietzsche here is saying that religion would usually do something where you would probably seek to destroy the passion. So, in other words, if the passion is leading you to sin or leading you to do something wrong, you destroy the passion itself. Well, this is going to be very important for Nietzsche. For Nietzsche, whatever is in human nature is in human nature by necessity. And therefore, for him, it's foolish to try to change that or make that different from what it is. So therefore, we have Nietzsche, and I'm going to kind of skip down to the second paragraph where he says, and I'm kind of in the middle of the second paragraph on page 25. And he says, the church fights passion by cutting it out in every sense. Its practice, its therapy is castration. It never asks, how does one spiritualize, beautify, deify desire? In other words, he is saying that the church or religious people in general never ask these questions of how should I take a passion and elevate it? Okay. So he says it never asks how does one spiritualize, beautify, deify desire. Its discipline has always emphasized eradication. And look at the sort of thing that he talks about that the church wants to eradicate, that Nietzsche is saying that no, maybe we should allow these things to have their full play in a human life. So, going back to the reading, eradication of sensuality, of pride, the ambition to rule, covetousness, and vengefulness. To covet something means that you see something that belongs to another person, and it's not that you want something like that, it's that you want that thing, okay? So then Nietzsche goes, by ripping out the passions by the root means ripping out life by the root. The practice of the church is an enemy to life. And the reason why it is an enemy to life is because it forces you to rid yourself of the passions. Okay? So it would probably be helpful here just to stop and think about this a little bit. When Nietzsche is saying to live your passions, you have to be quite clear what he's talking about. This is not some sort of live your passions in the sense that if you like to go hang gliding, drop out of school and go do that. It could be that, possibly. Nietzsche might say that might actually be sort of foolish because at some point, how would you be able to support yourself? Okay. He is talking about following your passions in a much more primal sense. Okay. And not just these sort of, I just want to be happy and I'm going to follow my heart. Nietzsche would not necessarily say that's what he is saying here. He is saying that a human being should be allowed, and not only should they be allowed, but really in general, human beings are going to want to enact what they are. Okay? And so let me just stop right here. And I've got some stuff here on the board. I'll come back to this in just a minute. But for Nietzsche, there is a dichotomy between the strong versus the weak. The strong versus the weak. Okay? And in general, for Nietzsche, Nietzsche is going to side with the strong. The strong should have the prerogative to do whatever they wish to do. And the weak, well, that's just the way life goes. Some people are not as strong to pursue their desires as they want. Some who may even have to face kind of being on the short end of the stick with regard to the strong. Now, that kind of cuts across our sense of justice because usually, and granted, this is sort of an ever sort of present reality that we're always searching to do this, and sometimes we do it poorly, but we do believe that the law and that in general, the strong should use their strength to elevate and help the weak. Well, for Nietzsche, that is just a complete, to him, it makes no sense. Okay, and we're going to say why that is here in just a second. Well, I guess we could say why it doesn't make sense to be. And for Nietzsche, remember I said Nietzsche is an atheist. So I have this little thing called the list. Okay? And Nietzsche does not write this. I need you to make sure you understand this. So if you are going to look for this in your book, you are never going to find it. This is kind of something that I've kind of put together over the years of teaching Nietzsche and thinking about him. And so Nietzsche from the get-go kind of eliminates this idea that there is a God, okay? And we're going to have to get kind of clear on what Nietzsche actually means by God. When Nietzsche talks about God, he is not talking about some old man in the universe, although he certainly would say that didn't exist. He's not thinking of some, deity in the sky that has a thunderbolt. He's not thinking that God is just one more being in the world, okay? By God, Nietzsche sort of understands this as being itself. So being itself. Now, what does that mean? Well, this just means that this being just exists. This is reality, okay? And in most religious, at least in the three great monotheistic traditions of the West, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, all of them share, even if their theologies may differ here and there and in some important ways, but the thing that they do share in common is the idea that God creates the world out of nothing. That God does not need the world to be God. God is God, and then God brings a world completely into existence out of nothing. Okay, now at this point, this is not necessarily something I'm saying that you have to know, all right, or you've got to believe, but you got to understand it to at least appreciate where Nietzsche is coming from, okay? And so for Nietzsche, this being itself does not exist. And there's going to be a real important reason for this, because everything else on this list kind of follows in Nietzsche's estimation, and I think Nietzsche's probably correct on this, that if this goes, a lot of other things have to go too. For Nietzsche, there is no such thing as being itself. There is only becoming. Okay, there is only becoming for Nietzsche. So that means nature, everything in the world is always changing. Anything that is here today will be gone tomorrow. And life is this constant sort of flow of change, of flux, and there's nothing that's going to remain permanent. Okay? Well, this would certainly cut against the idea that there is a transcendent being who is beyond all change, all alteration, and in fact, any change and alteration that exists is contingent or dependent on this being's existence, because this is perfect being and he gives rise to things that do not change or that change, okay, which is mankind in the created world. So Nietzsche then goes, and normally I would spend a little more time on certain sections of this, but I'm going to kind of skip. So if you're saying, well, wait a minute, Nietzsche says, okay, there's no God. I don't really have a problem with that, because maybe I'm not necessarily somebody who's religious, and there's nothing wrong with that. But you're kind of, but this idea of the strong versus the weak, that sounds kind of stark, and that it might lend itself to some sort of injustice. Okay, well, if you look to page 27, Nietzsche is going to say, in this section 3 that starts on page 26, but we're going to look at page 27. He is saying that, look, Christianity and most religions want to conquer their enemies, okay? Nietzsche says, I actually, and people who think like me, want to keep the enemy around. And why do you want to keep the enemy around? Because for Nietzsche's mind, the enemy is a sort of a resistance. And in having something resist me, I have a greater opportunity to set myself apart and overcome that resistance. So it's almost, think about, kind of analogy of working out. The thing that builds your muscles, okay, is this idea of facing resistance of the weight and the gravity, right? Or maybe the tension if you're using a different sort of apparatus, okay? So Nietzsche doesn't say, oh, the strong have to conquer and eliminate all the weak. No, Nietzsche would say, because if you did that, there would be nothing for the strong to actually actualize themselves. And in fact, he says that you will never have a world where there was just only the strong, because remember, everything is always becoming. There's always change. There are going to be the strong and there's going to be the weak. So Nietzsche says, if that's the case, the only honest thing to do is to embrace that. And so he saying at the top of page 27, one is fruitful only at the price of being rich in oppositions. That's a nice way of capturing what he's trying to say. One is fruitful only at the price of being rich in oppositions. So you only become more, flourish, to the extent that there's something opposing you. And not only one thing opposing you, maybe your whole life is just one opposition. One remains young only under the condition that the soul not slacken, not yearn for peace. Nothing has become more alien to us than that former object of desire, peace in the soul, the Christian object of desire. Nothing makes us less envious than the morality cow and the fat contentment of good conscience. And then this is a very important part. When one has relinquished one has relinquished great life when one relinquishes war. One has relinquished great life when one relinquishes war. Hold one moment. So, that's a pretty powerful statement. Nietzsche is not looking to get to some place where we have sort of a society based in justice, or maybe like Marx envisioned a classless society where human beings no longer do labor, machines do it all, and now we have time for leisure. Because that would be saying that human beings are reaching a state where you get to a place where there's no possibility of change. You've kind of reached paradise or heaven. For Nietzsche, that place does not exist, and it is never coming. And to the extent that we yearn and we work for that, for this sort of that golden day when all things will be made right, or when there will no longer be any struggle or misunderstanding or whatever, Nietzsche says is utterly and completely a false way of looking at reality. And the only people who look at that type of reality for Nietzsche are the weak. And the reason why they do that is because they are afraid or unwilling to face the fact that life is going to be a continual struggle. There will be no guarantee. You might suffer greatly, and that might be it. And then that's your life. There is no afterlife. So Nietzsche says that only a few people would be able to look at that. It's almost like looking into an abyss and saying that there is no golden day coming. There is no heaven. There is no paradise coming. There's no classless society. That is never going to come. And he says that only the strong can look at that and affirm their lives as having meaning in that. Because for Nietzsche, the great man gives his life meaning. So, which is very different. All right. For Nietzsche, the great man or the great human creates their meaning in life. That's much different than the way most traditional religions have taught, and even maybe philosophies too, that meaning is not necessarily created. To a larger degree, it's found. Okay, you have to find meaning. The meaning's there, but you have to find it. Nietzsche says there's no finding it. The strong man just creates his own meaning. Okay. Now, for a lot of students that I've taught in the past, that notion has sort of a romantic sort of sound to it, that I'm going to create my own meaning. I'm not going to wait until I find one. Okay. Well, remember that we're in a philosophy class, and we always have to think through these ideas to see sort of where they lead. And if you can kind of, you can kind of look at where it leads and you think, well, yeah, I can deal with that, then that's fine. But we have to make sure we understand what he is talking about here. So I'm going to also read one more section, and then we're going to move on. And this is going to be found section 4 on page 27. He says, I put a principle into a formula, all naturalism in morality, that is, all healthy morality, is ruled by an instinct of life. Some decree of life is fulfilled by a particular canon, shall and shall not. Some restriction and hostility on life's path is thereby shoved aside. So, when he means naturalism and morality, he really is just saying sort of physical instinct. If you're living by your instincts, and particularly for your instincts to assert your will over the world, okay, to assert your will of what you desire, of what you're looking for in the world, that, he says, is a healthy morality. Now, most traditional moralities would say that that's being sort of prideful, or it's being arrogant or insensitive, okay? But again, all of those moralities are thinking that there's some being who has created the world in such a way, and it's almost kind of like the Euthyphro problem we could kind of think about. That this being is wanting us to be a certain way in the world. Now, there might be some question, is the being wanting me to be that way because that's just the way he wants it, he said it, or he's wanting me to be that way because that's the way reality really is. The fabric of reality requires that I do be mindful of my neighbor, okay? But for Nietzsche, if this being doesn't exist, then this idea of good and evil, as we understand it, does not exist either, okay? And so, therefore, we're not doing anything what sounds like, oh, you're being arrogant or wrong. Well, Nietzsche goes, no, no, no. There's no such thing as evil in that sense. So then he goes, anti-natural morality, that is, almost every morality that has been taught, honored, and preached up to now, turns instead precisely against the instincts of life. So pretty much every religion and every morality, okay? It is sometimes hidden, sometimes loud and bold condemnation of these instincts. By saying God looks into the heart, it says no to the lowest and highest desires of life and takes God to be life's enemy. The saint in whom God delights is an ideal eunuch, and a eunuch is someone who's been castrated. It's kind of an arresting image. Life ends where the kingdom of God begins, okay? And so therefore, there is no God to look into the heart, because for Nietzsche, God doesn't exist. And therefore, if God doesn't exist, neither is there any morality, okay? Because morality, most moralities will focus on this idea that there is good and evil. But good and evil in the moral sense depends that there be some being which says this is the way we should be. Now, if you're saying, well, what about evolution? Could evolution kind of do this for us? Well, Nietzsche kind of sees this and kind of understands it a little bit. And he would say, well, yes, life is sort of evolving. But the problem is that I, too, am a part of that evolutionary process. And therefore, I'm just sort of a link in a chain, okay? I don't really have any particular agency or power to really change anything on my own free will. I'm just a part of a larger process. So could there be a change in a morality? Well, there could, maybe. But Nietzsche would say, if you look at nature, nature tends to favor that which is stronger, that which is hardier, that which can endure more hardship and struggle, okay? And weaker natures like that just don't last as long, okay? So anyway, let me kind of move on a little bit from here. And so we will now look at the next portion of our lecture here, and this is the four great errors. So I'm going to kind of go through these a little quickly. so we can kind of see where we're going. So, but the four great errors, basically the next section over, it starts on page 30. Okay. And I'm just going to kind of list these errors out for you. Okay. I may not write them on the board. I'll just kind of go through them and then we'll talk about them a little bit. But Nietzsche talks about these things called the four great errors. And for Nietzsche, these are great errors that take place in thinking. Okay, so the first error that he's going to talk about is the error of confusing cause and effect. Okay, so the first great error, it's on page 30, on section 1, is confusing cause and effect. Okay, and he says that this is probably one of the more dangerous errors that we can have. Okay, and he says that this is something that we see a lot of time in religions. And so he starts off talking about this guy named Canaro, who was Luigi Canaro, who was an Italian who lived 16th century, and he was very well known. He actually had written a book on just his manner of life and how he ate and everything, and that his manner of living sort of contributed to his long life. And so, you know, even in the 15th century, people were interested in the health of the body, you know, kind of like diet crazes like we have today, you know, keto and these sort of things like that. People were interested in that back then, which, you know, kind of tells you that there's some things about humans that always kind of stay the same a little bit. Well, Nietzsche said that, Canaro said in his book that if you ate like him, you would have the same sort of long life that he had. Okay. But Nietzsche says, but what Canaro did was confuse cause and effect. His long life, his diet was not necessarily causing the effect of his long life. Nietzsche flips it around and says that Canaro's diet was an effect of a prior cause in Canaro's own physiology. In other words, it was sort of well known that he couldn't eat certain like really rich foods and stuff because he got sick. You know, I mean, he may have been lactose intolerant or something. And so he ate a really skimpy sort of diet. And he didn't do this of his own free will. He did it because he had to. And because he had this sort of metabolic sort of condition kind of slowed down a little bit, it actually, though, in some ways contributed to his longevity. But Nietzsche says, but hey, this is the problem. Most people were thinking that, oh, Canaro's diet is a cause of the effect of his long life, when it was not that way at all. And so Nietzsche says, and we're looking on page 31, he says, a race of people is destroyed by vice and luxury. All right. So the church would say, if a people, you know, kind of living, you know, just luxurious lives and are full of vice and envy and anger and all this sort of stuff, that's what causes them to fall. Well, Nietzsche says, my reconstituted reason says, when a people is perishing, physiologically degenerating, the effects of this are vice and luxury. That is, the need for stronger and stronger and more frequent stimuli, the kind of stimuli that every exhausted nature needs. Okay. This young man gets prematurely pale and flabby. His friends say that it was due to such and such a sickness. I say, on the other hand, the fact that he got sick, that he did not resist the sickness, that was already the effect of an impoverished life, an inherited exhaustion. So, in other words, Nietzsche is saying that when things are looking bad in a society, uh, the bad things that are happening in the society are not necessarily the cause of what's going bad. It's sometimes could be the effect of a prior condition that is taking place. Okay. Um, and so that's an important thing for us to remember. All right. The next thing that we will do is look at the other two or three four great errors. Okay. Um, the error, and this one we're going to spend a little bit of time on because it's kind of important. And this is called the error of false causality. He says, in every age we have believed. So the first error is the error of confusing cause and effect. The second error is the error of false causality. In other words, the error of causes that aren't really causes at all. We think they're a cause, but they're not. And they're not a cause because maybe they don't even really exist, okay? Or they're just phantoms. So he says, in every age, we believe that we know what a cause is. But where did we get our knowledge, or more precisely, our belief that we have knowledge about this? Now, this is very important. For Nietzsche, there's something very subtle going on here. Because he starts off saying, hey, we think we know what a cause is. But he says, where did we really get this idea that we understand what causes are and where causes come from? Where is this coming from? And he says, picking up where I just left off, from the famous realm of the internal facts. Now remember that, underline that. That's a very important part. The internal facts. And he continues, none of which has up to now to be proved factual. We believe that we ourselves were causal in the act of willing. Likewise, we never doubted that all the antecedents of action, its causes, were to be sought in the consciousness and could be discovered there if we looked for them, discovered as motives. Otherwise, the actor would not have been free for the action, this is important, or responsible for it. Finally, who would have disputed that a thought is caused, that the eye causes thought? Okay. So, if we're looking at our little list here, there is no being itself. And because there is no being itself, there is no good or evil. The world just exists. It's almost like looking at a rock and asking, is it good or bad? The rock is not good or bad, it's just there. Or it's like maybe watching one of these nature programs and maybe you see a lion. I think I brought this up again, maybe with the Kant lecture. And you see a lion and it goes after a young gazelle and pounces on the young gazelle and eats it. And maybe it make us feel bad and we say, oh, that was bad. But nobody would say that the lion is morally responsible, that the lion committed murder. Even if we had, let's just say, a beloved pet, Fufu the poodle or something. And, around our neighborhood here on the Nextdoor app, apparently there's some hawks around here, and some people have had trouble with some small pets being sort of preyed upon by these raptors, by these birds. So like small little miniature poodle or Yorkie or something being picked up by this bird and taken off. Well, that would make us feel bad because I have a dog myself. I'm kind of attached to the animal. But if you found the hawk's not guilty of murder. You don't apply a moral category to an animal because morality doesn't hold. The animal is not recognizing good and evil. Okay? There is no morality. Therefore, the animal, the hawk or the lion that eats a gazelle, they're not morally responsible. They're responsible in that they ate something, but you wouldn't go to the hawk and go, man, hawk, that was awful. You're a terrible animal for hurting this other little creature here. Well, no, you wouldn't do that. Okay? Well, Nietzsche says human beings are, in a certain sense, in the same condition as the hawk and the lion, or maybe the Yorkie or the little gazelle. You're just a part of nature. And some things prey, and some things are preyed upon. And that sounds bad. And Nietzsche would say, well, yeah, it might sound terrible, but if there's nothing but brute, physical, material existence, then the idea of trying to overlay some sort of moral category onto it, Nietzsche says it's just a form of dishonesty. For Nietzsche, that is dishonest. Now, I'm not saying that there's anything wrong with having morality, because obviously we're teaching an ethics class, right? But we need to understand where Nietzsche is coming from. And Nietzsche does have some pretty strong ideas that all people should sort of wrestle with and try to understand them. And if we disagree with them, try to understand why they're wrong, okay? So the three internal facts, he's just told you what they are. But if we look on page 32, he goes over them. The thing that kind of gives us this idea, this belief that we actually know things, that we can actually cause things in the world, choose to do good or choose to do evil, he says comes from these three internal facts. He begins talking about them on page 31, but he's a little more pointed with them on page 32 at the top of the page. He goes, of these three internal facts, which seem to vouch for causality, and by causality, he means personal causality as a human being. The first and most convincing is the fact of will as cause. Then secondly, the conception of consciousness, which he calls mind, as cause, and still later of the I, or the subject, as cause. Okay? We're merely born after causality had been firmly established by the will as a given, as an empirical fact. Well, so what Nietzsche does here is says, hey, where do we get this idea that we are responsible, that we can cause either good or evil in the world? He says from the three internal facts, and I will go ahead and just do this for you here. All right. Three internal facts. Okay, the three internal facts. And so what's going on right here? Well, the first is free will, that your will is free. But the hawk or the lion's will is not free. Okay? It is not free. It just does what it does, and it's an animal of prey. The gazelle is not free. It can't just say, you know what? I'm tired of being a gazelle. I'm going to be a lion now. No, it's not going to be a carnivore in that way. It's just going to enact whatever its nature is. And the same is true for human beings. So there is no free will. And this idea then, but the other thing that kind of is doing the work here too is this idea of a mind, or what he calls the conception of consciousness. Or if I would, maybe another way of understanding consciousness, conscio means to know with in Latin. It's a compound word, con, with, it's not like in Spanish, con, right? But sciere, to know with, consciousness. What are we knowing with? We know, we know the mind, we use the mind, we self-reflect, but Nietzsche says that mind itself, insofar that it reflects back and says, oh, I have free will, I can choose between good and evil. He says, no, that's a fantasy. That's almost like operating under a form of delusion. Okay? And then these two things together, the free will and the mind, is usually what most societies have said constitutes the self, okay, or the I, okay? And so this is pretty, now let's look at where we are here. Now, Nietzsche's saying, so there might be some folks, and this is where some of my students who may not necessarily be religious might have started kind of wondering about Nietzsche a little bit because, okay, so we can get rid of God, and that's probably not a problem, but we'll keep everything else. But it looks like that if you get rid of God, this being itself, it looks like a lot of other things kind of go with it. Now, maybe you might disagree, and there might be other philosophers who would disagree. Well, Nietzsche would kind of put it on them to say, well, it's up for you to show where I am wrong. Okay? And Nietzsche would say it's probably not even possible, but we can maybe talk about that in a minute. But even a philosopher like Jean-Paul Sartre, who was a 20th century philosopher and who was a non-believer, kind of agreed with Nietzsche that, really, if there's no God, there is no preconceived morality that we have. We just have to kind of make it up as we go along. But Sartre kind of wants to bring back responsibility into the world, but we won't necessarily worry about that too much. Well, now we can get to this last section, and we're going to kind of have to move quick here, I guess, a little bit. This reason and philosophy, and it's on starts on page 18. So now the question is like, all right, so the three internal facts kind of give us this idea that we have a responsibility toward a morality that's based in good and evil, which comes from the will of God, or from how God creates the world, okay? And that's a little overly simplified, okay? Theology is to be much more complex than that, but we're just going to kind of go with it for right now to understand where Nietzsche's coming from. The question would then be well, where does all of this come from? Okay? Where does this whole thing, like, where can we trace, where does this begin? Well, Nietzsche is going to tell us in Reason and Philosophy. Now, this is, to be honest with you, it's not very long, but it can be a little dense. So when you're reading this, you need to take your time, okay? and make sure you understand what's going on. Okay. But the first thing he starts off talking about philosophers. Now, oddly enough, we're in a philosophy class. We're studying Nietzsche, but Nietzsche would never want to be known as a philosopher, okay? Because Nietzsche would say he's more of a psychologist. Because in Nietzsche's view, philosophers are always looking for this, for being itself. And by being itself, we, in a certain way, we're talking about reality itself. Like, what is really real? Okay. Now, Nietzsche kind of has a bad opinion of the philosophers because, in his view, philosophers try to live beyond the actual world they're in, the flesh and blood world, the world of time, the world of change, and they're always seeking this sort of permanent reality that's above change and everything. To some extent, Nietzsche is right that there are some philosophers who do that. However, there are other philosophers who are much more aware and appreciative of the, even though if they say that, yeah, there is a reality itself, there is being itself, they're also aware that, yes, but there is also this idea of becoming. So when we look at Plato, I think Nietzsche misunderstands Plato, doesn't read him deeply enough, or maybe reads him in a biased sort of fashion. But Plato certainly has a lively sense of this idea of becoming. Now, he's ultimately going to say, but there is something like being itself. Well, for Nietzsche, all bets are off once you do that. It can only be becoming for Nietzsche. So he says that what the philosopher is looking for is anything that that will keep things in a fixed position where we can know them and know them securely. Okay. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to skip to page 20. And I'm just doing this to try to get us a good handle on things, and then you can kind of read through this a little slower to yourself. But if you look on page 20 and you look at section 5, okay, he says, and I'm going to start reading there, and we're going to find out where exactly is this error of all of this. Where is it traceable to ultimately? So he says, finally, let's present the different way in which we, I politely say we, view the problem of error and illusion. Okay. So then he goes, it used to be that one took alteration, change, becoming in general as proof of an illusion, as a sign that something must be there leading us astray. Okay, so here he's just kind of talking about the philosopher being biased toward being itself. And so anything that was becoming, in Nietzsche's view, these philosophers would say is unimportant and not real. But he says, today, in contrast, it is precisely to the extent, and I need you to pay attention to a few phrases here. It is precisely to the extent that we are compelled by the prejudice of reason to posit unity, identity, duration, substance, cause, thinghood, being, that we see ourselves entangled in an error, forced into an error. So sure are we on the rigorous basis of a self-examination that it is here that the error lies. Now, he just told you where the error lies. The error in all these things, the idea of unity, like the idea that this book is a unified thing, okay? That it's a unified sort of thing, all right? So he goes, that doesn't exist. Neither does duration or a cause or thinghood or being. And he says, where does this come from? And he says, it comes from the prejudice of reason. The prejudice of reason. So, in other words, our reasoning ability, Nietzsche says, is prejudiced toward being. It says that there is something like the idea that the book is a unified whole. But to say the book is a unified whole is to posit it in such a way where you're saying it is this sort of thing and not something else. But Nietzsche wants to say that everything is always becoming. All right? So, just picking up where I just left off, he said, this, in the next paragraph, this is the case, is just like the case of the motions of the great star. It is the case that error, in that case, so by the great star, he means the sun. So in that case, in the case of the sun, error has our eyes as its constant advocates. Okay? Because when I look at the sun during the day, particularly at my house, the sun starts over here at this window, and by the end of the day, it's over here at this window. And my eyes, my physical senses would tell me that, no, the sun is moving. But that's not what's going on. What's going on is that we are moving around the sun. Okay? So, he says, in the case of the great star, error has its eyes as our advocate, whereas in the first case, its advocate is our language. Okay? In its origin, language belongs to the time of the most rudimentary type of psychology. We encounter a crude set of fetishes when we become conscious of the basic presuppositions of the metaphysics of language, or to put plainly, reason. Reason sees actors and actions everywhere. It believes the I as being, and the I as substance. It projects this belief in the I substance onto all things. That is how it first creates the concept thing. Because I think I'm a thing, I think that this is a thing. And so what Nietzsche is doing here is, where does all of this come from? It comes from the fact of reason, which reason, as Nietzsche has showed us, is prejudiced toward being itself. But then, what does reason operate in? Reason is dependent on language. But for Nietzsche, these things falsify reality. They are, in a sense, prejudiced against becoming. Because if I say book does not mean the same thing as pen. It is, in a certain sense, to make something a certain type of thing. And then I might be tempted to think that I am a certain type of thing. Okay? But I might be changing throughout my life, you might say, but Nietzsche, I'm not a tree. There is a difference between those two things. But Nietzsche is going to say, kind of push back against that. And the reason why he pushes back against that is because his whole philosophical edifice ultimately has to conclude that the whole error of morality, particularly a morality that's in the service of equality of all peoples, of a morality that's in the service of stamping out uh, predatory injustice, that is seeking to help those who are weaker than ourselves. All of that depends on this idea of being itself. And these two things are inherently biased toward it. And so the only way it would seem to free ourselves from this illusion is we would have to somehow get beyond reason and language. But then you might be asking, well, my goodness, how would we even begin to do that? Because what would human life look like if you were to have a child and that child could never talk? What sort of life would that child have? Now, certainly, and I have some experience with this because I have a son who's on the autism spectrum. Um, and he's made a lot of progress at Stride. He's in high school. He's doing fine. We're going to be getting his driver's license. But for the first few years of his life, he had like problems developing speech. And this had a lot of sort of consequences for him early on. Well, just think of like teaching no one how to speak. And you do have historical instances of people finding these, sometimes what are called feral children, or basically what it's been, children who've been horribly either abused or abandoned and never taught speech. So if Nietzsche is saying, wait a minute, reason and language is where the error comes from. We got to get beyond reason and language. And if you're thinking, well, that just seems almost impossible. Nietzsche himself is a bit aware of this as well. Because if you look on page 21, at right above section 6, he has this statement. It's the last sentence right above section 6. Reason in language. Oh, what a tricky old woman she is. I am afraid we are not rid of God because we believe in grammar. Reason in language. What a tricky old woman she is. I'm afraid we are not rid of God because we believe in grammar. Nietzsche sort of recognizes that as long as someone is willing to retain the need for reason and language, they are in some sense always sort of heading in this sort of direction. And Nietzsche is honest enough to admit that. Now you say, well, now where does this lead Nietzsche ultimately? Well, Nietzsche ultimately goes insane. Some people say that he had a prior sort of physiological condition. Others say that he had syphilis, but at some point he had a mental break, and he convalesced for the last 10 years of his life from the 1890s to 1900, and he was almost reduced to this sort of childlike state, not quite vegetative, maybe a little catatonic a little bit, but it had a psychotic break. Of course, the irony is that Nietzsche is aware that reason and language is inherently biased against the idea that everything is pure becoming. which that's what Nietzsche wants to say. He understands that reason and language is in favor of being itself, which traditionally most people think, is God or, Brahma or something like that. Okay. But how would this not drive you insane? If you're using the very means which you say are falsifying reality to try to uncover what reality is, it really seems to uh, get you into a situation that's very hard. You can't extricate yourself out of it. You're that's just kind of the way it is. So anyway, this is Friedrich Nietzsche. Um, and so if you have any questions about this, please let me know. Nietzsche is really, I don't agree ultimately with Nietzsche's conclusions about reality and morality, but I think Nietzsche has some very important sort of things to say to us. And one, I will just leave you with this. It's on page 5. It's one of his epigrams on page 5. And Nietzsche says, and it's the second epigram, he goes, even the bravest of us only rarely have the bravery for what we actually know. Even the bravest of us rarely have the bravery for what we actually know. And I think that's, whether you agree with Nietzsche or not, is a pretty profound statement. That there are a lot of things that confront us in our life, and even the bravest among us sometimes fail to have the bravery to confront the things that we actually know to maybe be true. And maybe that can encourage us to maybe push forward and to look at these things and to confront them. Well, as always, I will end our class on a poem here, and I hope you enjoy these, but I think it's pretty good to listen to some of these things and to deepen ourselves. And so this one I'm going to read is by the poet Kenneth Rexroth, and this is called Pacific Beach. This is the sea called peaceful, and tonight it is quiet as sleeping flesh under the October waning moon. Late night, not a car moving on the moonlit coastal highway. No sounds but the offshore bells and the long recurrent hiss of wind, surf. Sophocles long ago heard it by the Aegean. I drive 80 miles an hour through the still moon-filled air. The surf withdraws, returns, and brings into my mind the turgid ebb and flow of human loyalty. The myriad ruined voices that have said, "Ah, love, let us be true to one another." The moon-lured voyagers sleep in all the voiceless city. Far out onto the horizon, the lights of the albacore fleet gleam like a golden town in another country. Well, I hope you have a great week. I will also be posting your midterm exam for you. That will be posted probably tomorrow evening, and you will have the rest of the week to work on that. I hope you have a great week. Take care, and if I can help you with anything, please let me know. Good night.